Pete, welcome back to the show.
Awesome to be here. Great to see you in Texas, and yeah, what a time to be in Bitcoin, huh?
Yeah, exactly. So for listeners and just for anyone listening in future, we've just come from BitBlock Boom in August 2022 over in Austin, Texas. And as we speak now, I'm actually in Riga in Latvia for Baltic Honey Badger, which is another European conference. And Pete, you've written this article recently on how
Hmm.
to be a Bitcoin maximalist. And I think there's various ideas to explore here around essentially what are some of the principles of maximalism. What is it that maximalists actually believe? What should maximalists
Yeah.
actually do? So do you want to start off with why'd you write this?
Yeah, I'll start off with that. I mean, I think it's pretty clear like Bitcoin maximalism is under attack, right? So there's people all over the internet who seem to be mad at Bitcoin maximalists, right? And their accusations are kind of always the same, right? It's that Bitcoin maximalists are intolerant and belligerent, and it is actually Bitcoin maximalism. It is actually the belief structure that encourages that, right? So that's a bit of a sophisticated breakdown of the claim. Often it comes out as like sort of Twitter shouting, but at the root of it, that seems to be what they mean, right? That there's this rogue group of people who are irrational and sort of lashing out, at the world, right? And they're blaming Bitcoin maximalism, right? So as someone who comes from a background as a journalist or somebody who's research oriented, it's like words have to have meanings, right? So therefore we have to break this down. And I wrote in the article, if you ask someone for a definition, if you ask two people about to define Bitcoin maximalism, you'll get four answers, right? So it seems to be there's a problem here. There isn't really a definition for Bitcoin maximalism. So what is it that people are actually mad about? So in this case, I essentially just tried to strip down the argument and say, okay, let's not talk about these bad behaviors and negative behaviors, which look, they exist in online communities. If we can strip out this kind of toxic nature from what people assume is Bitcoin maximalism, what is it, right? What is Bitcoin maximalism at its essence? And is it in fact bad, right? Is it actually encouraging people to do bad things, or perhaps maybe those people are just expressing something inefficiently, or maybe they think they're doing the right thing? Can we break it down on that level? And I think what I was able to find is that what I suspected, that essentially Bitcoin maximalism is actually a very coherent and I think valuable set of values. I think it's one that we all share. But again, there's the question that I think that this piece asks then is like, are we effectively communicating that message? And I think that the second part, I would say, perhaps not. But I think the best way to start having that conversation is to write down, okay, like, what is it actually that unites us, right? And are we actually projecting that positivity, or are we often kind of focusing on the negativity, right? So again, I think that's sort of the genesis about this, right? Kind of peeling it back, getting to the definition, and then circulating, right? This is Bitcoin. If you don't think my framework is useful, fuck me. You can lash on me on Twitter, make out something different. I'd love to hear people's critiques, but so far I think the agreement that I've heard from people is this is I think VJ said it well. This is an objective kind of case of like most Bitcoin maximalists this is what they believe, right? Whether that's always like very clear to other people is kind of a secondary question.
Right. And so in your piece, you also help delineate this idea of the ism from the ists. So can you
Hmm.
elaborate? What are you getting at there?
Yeah, so I actually had to look up the dictionary definition here, and I was kind of confused, right? Because people use Bitcoin maximalist versus Bitcoin maximalism. Like, am I a Bitcoin maximalist, or do I follow Bitcoin maximalism? So generally, an ism is a school of beliefs, right? It is the ideological and value structure, and then an ist is someone who follows that, right? So there's a bit of a separation where one is essentially a set of values. It is actually a ideology that's kind of divorced from the individual, and then the ist would be the person that embodies that, right? So I think you have to kind of draw a little bit of a line between Bitcoin maximalism and Bitcoin maximalists, right? It is possible that Bitcoin maximalists maybe don't understand Bitcoin maximalism that well, and therefore just kind of mistake or confuse these kind of things. And again, this is where like kind of toxicity gets caught up in all of this, right? And I think at the end of the day, like I think you have to believe that Bitcoin maximalism has to solve a specific problem, right? What is it trying to address, right? If it is to exist, like what is the point of the value structure? And I think to me that answer really became Bitcoin maximalism is about expanding Bitcoin. It is about, against, the essentially, who are our antagonists, the fiat world and the crypto world, right? A Bitcoin maximalist should want to expand Bitcoin, against those other systems, right? And eventually we want, Bitcoin to succeed and compete and outcompete these other things. Therefore, Bitcoin maximalism has to be that forward motion. Right. So I think, once I was able to kind of crack that, I was like, okay, that makes sense, right? Why do we need this culture around Bitcoin? If Bitcoin is just a tool, why is this culture even necessary? Well, the answer is that the culture exists to advance the tool, right? There has to be a relationship between those two things. And I think, you know, that's why Bitcoin maximalism formed. That's why we need Bitcoin maximalists. But we also need that to be like a healthy dynamic, right? We need actually to have a clear conversation about what our values are, and then we need to be able to kind of, because again, I think everybody's had an experience where like someone they consider a Bitcoin maximalist does something online, and it's like very clear to them that that's not Bitcoin maximalism. So a good example would be like someone goes on Twitter and they just shit to post somebody else and they call them an asshole or something, and somebody's like, oh well, that's not Bitcoin maximalism. Okay, well, then you must know what Bitcoin maximalism is. Like it must be something that isn't getting mad at that guy on Twitter. So again, like that, so I think the piece kind of came from that and trying to peel those apart, right? So our expression of Bitcoin maximalism, why do we say like, oh, okay, well, that's not Bitcoin maximalism when someone does that? It's because we actually recognize that Bitcoin maximalism is a set of values, and that sometimes we fail to express that, and it is that imbalance that I think is revealed like in that moment, and why we know that they're separate. Otherwise, they would just be so intertwined. And I've used this example where it's, if why do I like the term Bitcoin maximalism? If Bitcoin is such a thing that you can just buy a Bitcoin and then you're part of the group, like that's it, like you don't have to do anything else, then essentially you've reduced Bitcoin to an NFT. We're essentially like a conservative Bored Ape Yacht Club where you can just buy, sort of some entrance, and then, you're always in the group, right? And then there's no wrong you can do. You're just, part of Bitcoin, right? So we need Bitcoin maximalism. We need to encourage people to do things that we think are valuable for Bitcoin and understand the values of Bitcoin, and then to express them positively. And I think, maybe there's a question of that all not working out super well right now.
Sure. And so there are times where people make parallels to religion, right? Let's say
Yeah.
Christians and Christianism, uh,
Mm.
and
Yeah, it
so
doesn't
on and
really
so
work
forth.
quite well on that point. Yeah,
So,
Christianity, I think it would be an itty at that point.
right, but I mean, you get the idea. In that idea,
Yeah.
Christians would be the ists, and the
Mm.
Christianism or Christianity is the ism in
Christianity,
this
yeah, would
case.
be the ism. Yeah.
Is the
Hmm.
ism in this case. But I mean, you get the idea. Do you
Hmm.
see parallels there then between Bitcoin maximalism and religion? Is there a parallel? Should that be
Well,
acknowledged,
again,
accepted,
I think it
promoted,
has
or
to
should
go
that
with
be
like
rejected?
what, like, yeah. Again, I think you have to go back to the question of like, is the culture useful, right? So, there was this old bit, kind of the person who I consider the father of Bitcoin maximalism, Moshe Pescu, and he used to sort of say there is no Bitcoin community, right? There's only the software and then using the software. Like there's no other part of Bitcoin, right? It is like you're either directly using the software or using it at that moment, or you just don't exist from Bitcoin's perspective. And I think you have to kind of start from that. So then you sort of say like, well, why is the culture necessary, right? And I think the answer to that is that we're not okay with Bitcoin just being the tool it is today. We want to expand its use. So I'll give you an example. So like we often refer to Bitcoin as a tool for like insurance or financial catastrophe or some sort of insurance policy kind of on the world, right? Well, sure, I own a fire extinguisher. I have one of them. I never use it, and it's in my basement somewhere. And I own it because someday I might have to put a fire out. And there's no culture around this tool that doesn't seek to advance anything other than its own utility to me personally, which is I can use it, to put out a fire if I want, and that's why I own it. And my ownership of it doesn't extend beyond that. So if Bitcoin is just that, if it is only that, and we don't need to expand it further, then I agree, like Bitcoin culture might not be useful. But so since we have this Bitcoin culture, we must want to achieve something with it, right? There must be an attraction to that. And I think, the answer is, whether you call it religion or not, you see this with a lot of groups that have a culture, right? So like America has like patriotism, right? So the actual values, the actual ism might be the Constitution, but then the ists of like America are patriots, right? People who want to further American values. So in any large enough culture, essentially you have this tension between, what are the values, and then how do people express them? And then I think like everybody knows and has had experience of cultures where they feel out of line with that culture, or the culture has to actually have a conversation with itself and say like, are we holding up these values. Like a good example would be like, after 9/11, sort of in the war on terror, there was a lot of that in the United States, right? Have we become the empire that we, essentially have always, thought we were the antithesis of? And that came from, and there was a lot of tough conversations about being a patriot at that time and what that meant. But essentially, this is about the culture maturing, and Bitcoin's culture is maturing, so therefore it must have some value. And I think it's obvious that Bitcoin culture has value, right? It helps people convince people that Bitcoin is the right tool. It helps them understand why in other systems like fiat and the crypto system, they're at a disadvantage and why they might want to opt out of those systems. And so the culture then is an antithesis to that. And then the culture is only useful in how much it achieves that goal, right? So therefore, now you have now you understand now the culture has a place and it has a goal, and then you can sort of evaluate the performance of it, which I think is kind of the ideal. And again, I go back to sort of the other cultures. I think in every other instance you can look at that. So in your specific example, like Christianity, like the goal of Christianity is to convert more people to Christianity, to their religious rule set, and to convince them to live by their moral values. And the religion is only as strong as its ability to do that. And over time, Christianity has done that very successfully. It's the largest religion. But we would also, as people who are, I'm not a practicing Christian, so I'm outside of that right now. You could say, like, there's always problems where, like, that culture, my dad is a practicing Catholic, constantly kind of talking about, what they can do better to reach people, and there's lots of different tensions within those factions. And that's where you get into kind of, I think, a lot of the subjects that, podcasts are good for, which is talking about, what the culture and value sets are.
Gotcha.
But yeah, I
Because
see this
people
as
would
all sort of
disagree,
intertwined.
right? Because you can have Christians who disagree, and you can have Bitcoin maximalists who disagree
Yeah,
what
right. I
what
think,
true
yeah.
maximalism is. Even in Christianity, there are different, you know, subgroups, and it's the
Yeah,
same
for
kind of thing.
sure.
Even
Hmm. Yep.
in the I guess the broad school of thought of Bitcoin maximalism, there are those who, let's say, believe, as an example, that it is a more descriptive belief, that it's not as much of a prescriptive. It's more like a Bitcoin is the best money, and it's it's money's going to 10 to 1, and that's a descriptive kind of argument. Like it's
Yeah,
kind of
and I think
more
that's a fine
dispassionate and
belief,
neutral.
right? And then it's a question of, like, okay, well, does that belief actually, what is the value of it, and is it enough to achieve the objective? And I think in that case, what I see forming in the community right now is, like, there's some people who just say, yeah, Bitcoin's the best money, like, it doesn't have to change over time, it will just win. And that's an inevitability. I can't do anything about that, and I don't want to do anything about that. I'm going to buy into that vision, and that's it for me. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I think that's fine. I don't have a particular issue with it, other than, I do think there are a whole other group of people who say, like, hey, no, like, if Bitcoin is the best system, I want to actively evangelize and get people off the other systems. I want to get them to using it today, and therefore we should consider, all these other tool sets, and adoption mechanisms. And ultimately, I think both those groups will have to coexist. There's actually nothing wrong about either of them in isolation, right? Because they're both good for the ultimate goal. It just suggests that, like, you as an individual have some choice, right? Again, like, that's sort of what we should be about in Bitcoin, is just choice, right? So, in me putting down these values, it isn't really to suggest that everyone has to follow them. It's just, I'm sort of making a critique here where I think, you know, again, if you are okay with Bitcoin just being a tool and you don't want to advance it, you have to then accept that other tools exist, and that if you don't do anything to get rid of them, your hatred is sort of, like, misplaced. So I'll give you a good example with, like, stable coins as an example, right? So that there's a hot kind of debate in Bitcoin right now about stable coins. So if we as a Bitcoin community don't do anything to bring that technology. I wrote in the piece, that one of the values most Bitcoin maximalists share is crypto minimalism, right? That they have to actually want to kind of reduce the amount of other, tools that exist outside of Bitcoin in the cryptocurrency sphere, and bring them back to Bitcoin. And I actually believe that's one of the most important ones. Because essentially, if you don't want to reduce that tool, if we don't want to bring it back to Bitcoin, whether it's stable coins on Liquid or, Taro with, like, Sats backed dollars, these are all interesting technologies. If those don't take off, and they still exist on other chains like Tron or Ethereum or whatever, then you haven't minimized them. They still exist. They'll still find utility there. And if ultimately we're unwilling to bring that technology here, then it has to exist. So then I would question your hatred of that system, right? So I think we have this word. There's another word I don't like: shitcoins. I don't think it actually really means anything. I think anybody actually agrees on what it means. So I like crypto minimalism better, because I think crypto minimalism evokes two things. It's one, that there are cryptocurrencies. They just empirically exist. They're there, and people can use them. And it suggests that our attitude should be to minimize them, to actively reduce those, to the extent that they're performing useful financial services, migrating them back to Bitcoin, thereby reducing the need for them. And that it's actually will be our actions that decide how much other cryptocurrency type systems exist, right? And it's our tolerance of these systems that will allow them to continue. So, the example that I've used in this case to get people to understand this, especially people who are new, is that Lightning didn't always exist. It's something that we as Bitcoiners had to design and build. And the reason we did that is because we wanted Bitcoin to not just be a settlement system; we wanted it to be a payment system, right? That was one of its original value propositions. Many felt that that was just a useful tool for money, and so we had to build this system, right? We had to decide that we wanted to do it. And there was a whole period of time where there were many payments cryptocurrencies, just cryptocurrencies that were saying, hey, like Bitcoin's a store of value, like we're a payments cryptocurrency, right? So there were all these like Monero, Dash, all these different things that you don't hear about anymore. And why? Because Bitcoin has essentially now outcompeted those things. It is now both a store of value and a payments method. And right, it's still in the middle of that competition, but it was our unwillingness as Bitcoiners to allow those things to exist somewhere else that mitigated them. And my hypothesis is that that's probably the right relationship to having going forward. It does a lot to justify our antagonism to that system, because I think that's most confusing for people who are like outside, they're in the crypto world. They're like, why are you attacking us? Like, we're just, building a service that people want. And I think our answer to that, should be, well, hey, like we think that these services are actually going to be better for people on Bitcoin. Therefore, we are antagonistic to you. We are trying to reduce the amount of these other systems that people need to rely on. But that's our goal, right? And therefore, we can. I talked about this a little bit with Tomer Strolight on the Swan Signal yesterday. It's like, we can be better at positively expressing those values. Those values can still be antagonistic. Like, I don't think there's anyone here who doesn't want to actively reduce the number of cryptocurrencies that are out there. I think that's kind of everybody's goal. So, but we do have to maybe get better at like people understanding these other systems. Like, hey, yeah, that is our goal. We're going to be antagonistic to you, but that's just maybe the natural state, right? Like, you want to profit and do something that doesn't exist on Bitcoin. We think that you're wrong. Let's have at it, right? That's there's fair competition in a lot of economic market sectors, kind of along the same lines. So there shouldn't be anything like taboo about this.
Yeah. Okay. So one way to think about it could also be to say Bitcoin is likely to win, or going to win, but people can try. You can try this altcoin if you want. Like, I think that's kind of the more, let's say, the maybe a slightly more neutral or dispassionate view. I think that other Bitcoiners do, some of them do take, and then of course there are others who go even further, and let's say they're almost totally agnostic about what coin they use from their point of view. They'll just take whatever coin uh, uh, in their view serves that role. Whereas obviously I would,
Well,
where I
I
can
think a
use
lot of those
Bitcoin, I
people
will
are
use
like
Bitcoin.
self-interested, like, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
Like, a lot of those
Oh, of
people are like
course.
really like self-interest maximalists. Like, this is like the degen shitcoiner mentality, right? Like, so they're in a whole other like value set where it's like, and the question then is like, are we effectively getting them out of that, right? Because they're essentially, they're here to just profit off anything, right? And then, it's sort of our tasks as like Bitcoin maximalists, I think, to then sort of tell them like, hey, that's not an effective mindset, right? Like, hey, I've been there. I've potentially lost almost everything because of all the collapse of these things. You should save some in Bitcoin, right? Even if you hate us and you think all of this random garbage that people are saying is correct, like American Hodl says, like, love yourself, buy Bitcoin. The question then is like, do we have a responsibility? Do you want to give these messages? And look, again, at the end of the day, I respect that some people don't care. I just think it centers the conversation a little bit more on like, what do we want to achieve? Like, what responsibilities do we have? And then, how are we going to kind of explain what we're doing to the rest of the crypto world? Which, again, I sort of say this all the time to the folks in the journalism community, which is that, Bitcoin exists and it's going up in value over time. You have to have some explanation on that. Otherwise, your opinion like isn't relevant. And in the same case, I would say to Bitcoiners, it's, cryptocurrencies exist. Like, they continue to be made. Like, you have to have some outlook on them. I think our outlook on them is that, we want to diminish them. We actually want to outcompete them. And I think if we have that aspiration, we should be clearer about that. And again, like there's nothing wrong with antagonism in itself, right? But then like antagonism can sometimes cross over into like, and this is where I think it gets a little weird, which is like supremacy, where it's like, oh, I want to eradicate and destroy like all of those things, and they should never exist. And supremacy is kind of a word where it's like a little, it doesn't bring up any good connotations, but like, you have to kind of wonder, it's like, have you crossed over into supremacy where it's like you're so angry that these other things exist that you really just want to destroy them, and you're just entirely negatively motivated
Yeah.
at that point.
What about the notion then of, let's say, seeding the turf? Like, if you just view it like, no, Bitcoin should just be money and it shouldn't be trying to do all these other things, or maybe some of these other things are not sustainable. So I would rather seed that turf and let some shitcoin handle that because I'm focused on getting the money right.
I think that that's a great like way to put it, is actually like seed the turf. Like, yeah, you have to actually then be willing to allow, again, this is why I said I frame it like I like crypto minimalism because it suggests what I think is true, which is a lot of these things exist at our behest. They exist purely through our willingness not to replace them or our disinterest in replacing them. Because if you ultimately believe that Bitcoin is a system that can expand potentially to do all these things, right? That's been the claim of Bitcoin maximalists sort of forever, right? Is that oh well, a long enough timeline, we can do these smart contracts, we can do these, you could Bitcoin, NFT started on Bitcoin, all these things are just stuff we're going to be able to rebuild over time. Well, so then you get the question of like, do we want to do that? And this is why I often say that like in a world where Bitcoin maximalists like sort of accept ossification, or a world where Bitcoiners accept ossification, like I don't know how maximalism exists. Because it doesn't have like a forward direction at that point. You're just sort of accepting that Bitcoin is as it is today, and that people will find utility elsewhere. I think in that point maybe you could be a Bitcoiner and be like very strongly like kind of for Bitcoin as a tool that you could use, and probably the best money amongst other monies. But then you still sort of have the problem of that like forward direction, right? And this is like kind of the tension that I see in a lot of Bitcoin maximalists right now, is that there's why has the online conversation become so difficult? Because it's become very difficult for us to talk about what it is we're trying to achieve versus this other cryptocurrency systems. Like we see them getting bigger, there's like more kinds of like random shit happening on them, and I think it's unclear to the culture like what our attitude is to them, right? Like the culture right now, it's like we're just sort of attacking those things. We're just saying, hey, these are bad investments, these will go to zero. Um, and again, I think this is where some of the criticism against Bitcoin maximalism has been fair. It's sort of like, well, what if that doesn't happen? What is going to be your response then? Because then you're sort of your ideology at that point is going to look like it is incorrect, right? It's going to just appear to people as if it's like not functional what it's trying to achieve, right? And I think especially around like the Celsius and like kind of all those things collapsing, Bitcoin maximalism definitely took like a really big victory lap, right? We were like big kind of proponents of custody and like owning your own keys, and I think in the article I try to say that like Bitcoin maximalists, what we want to be is critical of these things, and we should be, and we have the right to do that. But then we also have to build other products and services that then can replace them. Otherwise, like people are still going to use them, right? So there is a push pull on these two dynamics, right? So if we don't build something better, one of the great products I think that's cool right now is Fedimint, right? They're talking about kind of advanced custody techniques, and to see that stuff is out there like that is really cool, and that's a Bitcoin maximalist effort in my opinion, because we are trying to increase the quality of custody. We are actually opposing these like centralized lending services and these other crypto DeFi type lending services, and we are actually making ground there. And to me, that's the right cadence for Bitcoin maximalism, right? It's like we have a clear antagonist. The antagonist is clearly bad. We're putting in the effort to make up ground there, and it is that culture that is driving that movement forward. And that to me feels like a really like solid example, like the Lightning example that I pulled out, like the US dollar stable coins on Taro. But then again, it's like our culture has to then unify behind that, and then we have to make the progress, because we're not going to be able to kind of compete against the zillion shitcoins, right? We can't do all the things. We have to be really, choice with our energy as Bitcoiners, right? I think this is like a lot of the frustration from the people who are critical of Bitcoin maximalists. Like these days, they're saying like, "Oh, well, all these things exist outside of Bitcoin," right? Sure, because we're we can't compete against the Cantillon effect of all these coins. Like you just can't. So then you have to be slow and measured with how we advance Bitcoin. And I think if you look back at the history of Bitcoin, you'll find that Bitcoin maximalists, Bitcoiners, have been slow and methodical in how they're advancing Bitcoin. And we're not going to be the most glistening casino thing at any given point, and that's an advantage. But we have to keep marching forward, right? So I go back to it where it's in a world where we accept ossification, where we don't compete against the status quo, then I think maximalism doesn't exist.
I see. Okay. And so, to your point about progressing forward in a centralized ecosystem versus progressing forward in a decentralized ecosystem, this has long been an argument amongst a lot of Bitcoiners also, where, for example, it's a common thing where people say, "Oh, look, there's actually some old thread on Bitcoin Talk where that
Yeah,
idea was proposed years
yeah,
ago and it got shot down, or for whatever reason, it wasn't feasible, robust, scalable, decentralized, etc. It didn't tick all the right boxes from a Bitcoin point of view." And I'm sure you,
hmm
as a bit of a resident Bitcoin historian, you definitely appreciate that also, having obviously trolled through the history
yeah.
records.
Tons of bad ideas for sure.
Yeah. And perhaps some ideas that maybe weren't ready yet, right? And, I'm sure at one point Lightning or payment channels, people were talking
Right.
about that in the early years on Bitcoin Talk forums and IRC and so on. And then it only got actualized in, let's say, early 2018 when the
Well, yeah, that's
Lightning
the thing,
Network
right? It's
started.
like I think we've been good at differentiating from the crypto system as saying like, hey, look, a lot of these systems that are achieving these things today, they've taken the easy route to get there. And this has always, I think, been where the criticism against, Ethereum from people like Greg Maxwell has been most effective by sort of saying like, yeah, look, Ethereum has achieved this, system of applications, but what they don't have is they don't have social consensus on a monetary policy. They don't have, the ability to kind of run their own software. And as kind of you go through the values that I laid out in the article, Ethereum is sort of, you know, uh, absent every one of them. So the first one I wrote down was that, foremost, Bitcoin maximalists should want to preserve Bitcoin for future generations. Like we believe the system will exist in perpetuity. So, from a Bitcoin maximalist view, yeah, why would we ever want to do something like the merge? I mean, like, they can't guarantee in that instance that their protocol is going to be live or operational like the next day, so it couldn't be more antithetical to our value set, because our value set is actually that this is such an important system. We can't ever assume like what condition people would want to use this system is. We can't forecast the extremity of their circumstance. So yeah, like it's actually paramount for us that this system not only be operational today, but like every day in the future. For that's why we talk about long time preference, short time preference. Like Bitcoin has a super long time preference, right, or low time preference.
Yeah, low time
And you go to
preference.
number two, the Bitcoin running your own software, right? Like, so Bitcoin maximalists want to encourage people to run the software. We think that this is what gives you stakeholdership in the network. Bitcoin nodes cheap, really easy to run, can do it in a couple hours. Ethereum debates out, long Twitter threads, takes a couple weeks. Can they do something like a UASF? Unclear. The third thing that I said was, essentially the slow commitment to slow software changes and enfranchising all users. And then you look at the merge, and what is it doing? Anyone who disagrees with their technology plan is disenfranchised. Like you don't exist. You have to then build your own network. You're kicked off, right? You as a minority sort of cease to exist. And so yeah, again, like this is where I think it becomes helpful. Because oftentimes when we try to attack things like Ethereum and attack things like the merge, we really, I think, struggle to kind of say like, okay, like, we come off as like really angry and like negative. And I think like we can also just say like, no, like this, like we just don't believe in any of this stuff. Like our values, like what we positively think is opposed to this. And I think, our criticism might be taken or maybe be like more effective at kind of like raising this if we didn't appear so negative, right? Because I think for me, it's like very easy to dismiss something like the merge and just say like, yeah, look, every one of our values that we hold as Bitcoiners, it's like pretty antithetical. And, at the end of the day, if they want to encourage people to put value in that system, that's their choice. I can't stop them, but I'm not going to encourage you to do that. I'm not going to like be a part of a system, would have that sort of reckless kind of outlook. And again, I think the better that we are at positively expressing our values, like the more we're going to be effective, in making critique about them. Because at the end of the day, look, I think the merge is going to work. It's going to happen. And if it doesn't happen, like, I'll just be fucking honest. Nobody's going to fucking care because Ethereum doesn't exist in the same way. It doesn't have like an absolute structure. They're just going to go back to the drawing board. They'll try something else. They'll make something else up. There's no, structure. It doesn't have like a constrained structure of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a system of values and rules, and Ethereum at the end of the day is, kind of whatever it wants to be. So, they'll find a way to figure it out. So I don't know if it's a great use of our energy. And, my worry is that the Bitcoin culture, that our negativity and our attacks of Ethereum actually come from like our own insecurities. Like we're kind of insecure about Bitcoin. At the end of the day, I'm not. I don't have any insecurities about Bitcoin in relation to the merge. If it works, great for Ethereum. If it doesn't, I'm sure they'll figure out something else and make up something else and move forward. They're very
Yeah,
creative
sure.
people. Nothing
Yeah, and
else,
I mean, I think the point, as you were saying, is that Bitcoiners are encouraging people to run a Bitcoin node, whether that's on a Raspberry Pi or on your existing computer or your laptop, and encouraging people to actually use the tools, as Bitcoiners would
Mm-hmm.
say. And so I think that's important to understand, that the ecosystems are very different, and so that also goes into the next principle, which you said, and you were elaborating a bit there, this commitment of slow software changes and trying to enfranchise users. And so I think that's where also a critique comes. They say, "Oh, look, see, you Bitcoiners, it took forever to get Taproot," and
Yeah.
from their point of view, like there's not even that many people using Taproot, even though we are seeing. So, for example, LND is now moving to Taproot by default. We're
Honestly,
seeing,
that's the
you
biggest
know,
one, and I think this is number 3 is the one that took me the longest to understand, and I would argue that from a Bitcoin, like, fork wars perspective, like, the entirety of the fork wars was about principle number 3, and I don't think that anyone like, it took us years. I would say it took the Bitcoin community, like, 4 years to kind of understand that point, and it's a really deep point, and it's essentially that in a decentralized system, if it is to be truly decentralized, then no one can tell you what software is Bitcoin. Like you have to, like you as an individual get to make a choice of softwares, and as long as that software is compatible, it is Bitcoin, and that no action of any other individual or group can actually remove your access to Bitcoin. And I think this is why, like, the more and more I think about it, Bitcoin is an economy. It's a culture. It's like a rule set, and we do face opposition to other cryptocurrencies. But I don't know if they're actually like. I hate the crypto asset thesis. I just think it's so terrible. I really think there's just two competing cultures at this point. There's the Bitcoin culture, which has a very clear value set, and I think a pro user value set, a pro like human value set, like a value set that, like, as Jimmy Song says, is like very aligned with like classical liberalism and like morals, right? And the other value set, which is the Ethereum world, the smart contract platform world, which is move fast, break things, developers lead, the users follow. If it doesn't work, fuck them. They lost their money. They'll speculate on somebody else. Degen, anti-system, and the two cultures. It makes me sad that Bitcoin maximalism is viewed as such a negative culture because I can't think that it isn't like anything but. If you look at the shitcoin like sort of degen culture, it is so devoid like of any reasonable values other than like fuck you, I'm gonna get mine, damn the consequences, that it really says a lot, I think, about like that we haven't been effective in our messaging because like if you really actually understand the values that like each system expresses, like one of them I think is like very nihilistic like often almost to the point of like selfishness and greed like over everything else. And the other system, the Bitcoin system, is no, like we need to do what's right for everybody. Like we can't make decisions for everybody else. And yes, that is going to slow the ability for us to make these sort of technical upgrades, but it is worth it, and it will be worth it. And to me, that's the kind of fight that is really romantic about Bitcoin, is that we do have that aspiration, right? So
yeah, yeah, that's a really good way to put it. And I think on the question of being ineffective in quotes, as you were saying. I think that's where, let's say, some people like to critique Bitcoin as saying, look how ineffective you were. All these people just leave their coins on the exchanges, or they say, oh, look how ineffective Bitcoin maximalists have been. Look how many shitcoins there are. There's over 20,000 shitcoins. If you were so effective, there'd be less of them, right? That's kind of part of the argument.
Right.
But I think it's also not fair in other ways because it's not like Bitcoin maximalists can stop the creation of new shitcoins. And it's not like we're not already swimming uphill in some ways because there's just all these fiat incentives around us. And of course, there are going to be people who succumb or just go
What is
with the
it from
fiat flow.
Samuel L. Jackson, where he's like, the path of the righteous man is beset on all sides by the inequities and like the evils of the world, right? That is the thing, right? Bitcoin maximalism has to be aligned to that path. And, this is why I think, why I've been dismissive of the attacks on Bitcoin maximalism is like, yeah, like we have to walk against the opposition, right? We have to continue that forward direction because we are beset on all sides by evil. It is true. Like the fiat system, is an economy that continues to penalize us. Where people, who are average people, like can't get ahead. Does that mean Bitcoin is inflation hedge? I don't think that's true. But again, it's the whole system itself, has its pros and cons. And then, the crypto system at large, again, we are opposed to that. We have to be opposed to both of those things. And to me, that's what maximalism is. We have to strip maximalism down to what it is, right? And I think Bitcoin maximalism has to be the forward direction against both of these other systems. We have to oppose that. We have to have a system of values that opposes that. And we have to have a system of values that gives us direction and forward momentum against those systems. And I think to the extent that Bitcoin maximalism can do that, it's like very useful. And again, that's why I said like earlier, I was really trying to peel out toxicity because I don't think toxicity is that. I do really believe that toxicity solves a core problem, and the problem that toxicity solves is that we have to be able to protect Bitcoin from ourselves, right? At the end of the day, right? That's what toxicity is for. That's why it was created. But then toxic maximalism then kind of starts to become somewhat incoherent because, again, they're just two very different goals. One of them solves, okay, how do we move forward and how do we oppose the forces that are against us? Like that has to be maximalism, I think. Like, I don't know what else would be that. And then there's toxicity, which is, yeah, look, it's an unsolvable paradox, this idea that like any upgrade to Bitcoin is indistinguishable from an attack. And we have to live with that. And we have to become a culture that has a conversation around that. And that's what toxicity is. But then if you combine them, this is kind of where I get to the point where it's like, are they really compatible? Like, is toxic maximalism effective? Can it move us forward? And I almost think the question then is like, probably not, because they just do two different things. Like one of them, again, has to oppose other forces, and the other one of them, it just opposes us. At the end of the day, that was what gave rise to toxicity. And again, I don't think it's bad. I think toxicity is one of the greatest things Bitcoin had ever achieved. And, it's hilarious to me to see the Ethereum folks, realize that toxicity is good, right? They're talking about their own user activated soft fork, when and why that might be necessary. So they're also starting to understand that, Bitcoiners just hit an existential problem before them and they came up with a solution, and our solution, actually works for them, which is crazy, right? Like that's how good the solution is that they will probably need to use it. And that says a lot about why toxicity is good. But again, like, we should be asking, like, are these compatible ideologies, I think.
I see. And also in your article, you talk about this idea, the commitment of building on Bitcoin, using
Mm,
Bitcoin where feasible. Now, that is also certainly I see that in the
yeah.
Bitcoin community or in communities that use Bitcoin. I think perhaps one question that might come up is in cases where something can't be built on Bitcoin, does that then legitimate the creation of that shitcoin, right? Like, not that I'm not making that argument. I'm just saying that's kind of that's the argument that we might hear.
Well,
So
that's
how
why I
would
would
you
go
respond to
back
that?
to, like one of them, and the assumptions we have to make is like Bitcoin is only limited by our ingenuity. And I think, that's why I think that I like crypto minimalism, because we have to accept that some of these things are achieving things that can't exist on Bitcoin today, and therefore legitimately exist and are providing real services. The question then of like, will they ever exist on Bitcoin? That's always going to be up to us, right? And I think that's where it becomes, kind of like a positive way to frame it, where it's, sure, there might be ideas that, how short is short term, right? This is a good question, right? If Bitcoiners are so low time preference, short term might be 100 years. Like there might be, Monero or Zcash or some of these cryptocurrencies that purport to have better privacy. They might be better than, if you want privacy, they might be better than Bitcoin for some period of time. And that could be decades. It could. Does that mean there's never going to be a solution on Bitcoin? Does that mean like no point is anyone in the future ever going to figure out how to do that? I think the answer to that is also probably no, because again, we have to believe that if we are effective at creating more Bitcoiners and that we do create this culture that breaks ground against these other movements, then no, like the smartest people in the world will work on Bitcoin, and hopefully they'll find a solution. But it also gives us, I think, like a bit of humility and patience, because look, there isn't going to be, and I wrote this at the end of the piece, it's like there's no amount of like anger and like frustration that we can have that's going to remove all of these cryptocurrencies. There just isn't. They're just not all going to go to zero tomorrow. So then we have to do something with that frustration. We have to do something with that anger, and that has to be the positive. We have to get people to channel that in a positive direction, and that's why I view Bitcoin maximalism. It has to be directional. It has to be effective at convincing people to do the best that they can for Bitcoin. Because some of these other things, like the HODL culture, or the take on debt by Bitcoin culture, they try to get you to, like, if you're putting your self interest before Bitcoin, I have to wonder if you're a maximalist. I just do. That's not bad. I'm not trying to cast judgment on you. I'm just saying, like, Bitcoin should get to have all the things. Like, if like Bitcoin, if you're going to be a Bitcoin maximalist, like Bitcoin should, in every case, whatever is Bitcoin maximalism should be the best thing for Bitcoin. So I think, like, one of the most controversial things that I put in there at the end was like, everyone should use Bitcoin. Like, and if you're a maximalist, you have to believe that. You have to believe that everybody can benefit from Bitcoin. And that's everybody in the world. And do we always live up to that? Does everybody live up to that? It can be hard, but like a value set should be aspirational, right? Like there's a reason in Christianity that they have saints, because it's like so fucking hard to be a saint. It takes you like your whole life, and then you might die, and then like or like even like in the United States, we have the Presidential Medal of Freedom. It's like you were so American, you like lived up to our values to such a high extent. There's like a special medal that we give you. So I almost visit like Bitcoin maximalists. It should be like a lifetime achievement award. Like it's like before you die, like should be like kind of up there with the Walker. You'll be up there, and like they'll be like, what a podcast. Here you go. You effectively increased Bitcoin. Here's your medal, and then that's it. You're just like the lifetime achievement award. you know, you know.
Right. One other idea. So, politics is often the art of putting one principle against another, and in some
Mm.
cases, are there instances where some of these principles of maximalism or these guidelines of maximalism where they come into conflict? Right. So, as an example, this
Mm.
idea of keeping Bitcoin open and accessible for everybody, but on the other hand, it should be technological supremacy as well. And I think what happens is with the cryptography and the maths and the science and the computer, the networking and everything of it, it just seems to come out that, okay, for example, confidential transactions does not seem like it would be feasible to put into Bitcoin today, given those other aspects of accessibility, verifiability, openness,
Mm.
etc. So how do you wrestle with that aspect of it?
So you're talking about like the specifics of like the technical proposals, like, so since we can't get something like that in today, like what do we do about it essentially? Like
Yeah,
I
so
think we
as an
have to have
example,
that
there's people who want
conversation.
privacy in Bitcoin on chain.
Mm.
There are people who want, various other things,
Yeah, right, right,
but
right.
they're not all feasible.
Well, I think we like, in trying to define Bitcoin maximalism, I was always struck, and I could never really reconcile this, right? Is that there's what our culture expresses, and then there's what the developers do. And I think, modern Bitcoin maximalism and the current Twitter culture is very divorced from like the developers who I watched like growing up, right? So I think I was for a while trying to kind of reconcile these contradictions. And I think, one of the things that struck me is if you look at sort of Greg Maxwell or Andrew Palestra or all the kind of the great, Bitcoin developers, they were always interested in other ideas away from Bitcoin. Full stop. They always were. You look at when Mimblewimble came out, there was like a very active discussion in the community around that. Always, the developers in Bitcoin have talked about Monero. They've tried to understand its privacy tools. I mean, even Zcash, which comes from ZK Snarks, there was a whole conversation about whether that applied to Bitcoin. Ultimately, Zcash, essentially forked off and created their own coin. But that was a Bitcoin conversation. So, again, I think that the modern Bitcoin maximalism, way to handle this, the whole thing about like, oh, like don't be a shitcoiner, everyone's a shitcoiner, like no one's a shitcoiner. I had this conversation with Matt Odell where, everyone that I talk to seems to have an exception. Like, if we are against shitcoiners, if you're a shitcoiner for doing like one single thing against our values, like, well, then everyone I talk to has an exception. Developers all have like their one proposal they think is interesting elsewhere. Matt Odell will still talk to the guy who uses Monero because he's interested in privacy. Adam Back will still be interested in, US dollar stable coins and bringing them to liquid because he thinks they're an onboarding tool. Well, so then do we really have a culture that actually is shitcoin the best expression of our culture? And that's why I think crypto minimalism is better, because it suggests that like you as a maximalist, like you can still think something else would be best for Bitcoin, and you can still work on that and like have that aspiration, and it still kind of fits the mental model. Like Peter McCormack can still think that bringing leftists to Bitcoin is great for Bitcoin, and he can work on that, and it's his way of kind of working within the set, right? So I think this is one of the things when we talked last about my Nick Carter piece. I kind of said that like everyone seems to have their who is a Bitcoin maximalist, like who does all the things, and there was often this kind of like intense debate around whether you hated shitcoins or whether you were indifferent to them or like whether it mattered. And I think, if there was something I hope I could contribute to the conversation is I think it doesn't. I think like the right way to look at this is not to constantly judge ourselves for like whether or not we've said or done the right things. We can't become a judgmental culture like that. Just okay. So I'll give you another thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately, where it's is it better to do less bad or more good? Like, is it better to actively reduce the amount? I asked Jimmy Song this at the end of the conference. I was like, tell me what it is, because I think we become a culture that prioritizes doing less bad, and we've become a culture that venerates people merely because they don't do bad. Oh, well, why is he the best maximalist? Oh, he's never used a shitcoin. He's never said anything positive about Monero. Oh, he's never used an exchange. Well, in the end, you never did anything at all. You've just never done anything. So how do we get people to do more good? Like, at what point can you do enough good to outweigh the bad? And my fear is that we've become a culture that's like so insecure about its values that we've become so judgmental. And like now we're sort of like, this was the whole dumb thing around like, the whole Nick Carter episode where, oh, well, he's done more for Bitcoin than you. And like, like, well, what's the, I don't understand like what's happening here. Like what happened? Like why is our culture so concerned with judgment? And I think that's because we've kind of made Bitcoin maximalism this is like a possible standard. The like no one in isolation like actually fits this like mythical description of like the perfect Bitcoin maximalist who's never shitcoined. And so then our conversation is all about, oh well, Samson did this and this person did that, and like this thing is better than that, and it's like, the fuck are you talking about? like why are you having this fucking discussion? It's totally pointless. We should have a common goal. The common goal should be to reduce the amount of other cryptocurrencies there are and bring the useful stuff back to Bitcoin. I don't really care like who did what with like a token like 2 fucking years ago. It's like I'm a person of limited time. So again, that's like where the conversation breakdown like seems to happen. So I'm hoping this can help, because I think we have to say that a conversation like a culture that prioritizes doing less bad, it's just like what are you going to achieve in that culture? You're going to achieve sort of like just imagine a world of like in your head, like mentally, like imagine a world of people doing less bad. And in my head, I come up with, oh, this guy goes to work at 9 a.m, gets to work on time, and goes home and he tucks his kids in, and then imagine a world where people are doing more good, like where everyone is incentivized to do the most good. and it's just a vastly different world. It's like, oh, okay, like maybe this guy's gonna like donate some people things to the homeless like on his way to work, and like maybe he's a coworker who's like, feeling bad about himself, so he's gonna spend some time doing that. And oh, you just kind of go down the list, and it's just like they are two very different worlds. They seem to be. So I don't know. I'll leave people with that. The
Yeah,
less
sure.
bad, more good. What's better?
Yeah. So what are the other good things in your view that people can do for Bitcoin? I mean, does it relate to, let's say, getting adoption or helping merchants or helping grow the base of
Well,
hodlers? Like,
yeah,
what's good
yeah.
in your view?
Yeah, good is whatever is good for Bitcoin, right? And I think that we all get to interpret that, but I hope that these values speak to that, right? So I put there that our goal should be to expand the economy, like that we should want to do that, and we should push ourselves to do that. Because again, if we make it a label, this is what is really infuriating as an outsider to the Bitcoin culture. That the thing that sort of infuriated me for the longest time is that like, we seem to kind of again like have this idea, well, he's a Bitcoiner, and like, oh, you can never say anything bad about him because he's a Bitcoiner. Therefore, everything that he does is good for Bitcoin, which is kind of an irrational view. It's really just like, was the action that you took, was it good for Bitcoin or not? And did you and could you have done something for Bitcoin, right? So I tend to use this framework personally to try to push myself. I do go to the grocery store. I spend $300. I have never talked to that merchant about accepting Bitcoin. Maybe I should. Maybe that's my small way that I contribute and do something better. And we have to, and this is what Mr. Hoddle, I was talking to him, he's saying, oh well, I tried that, and it didn't work, and those people didn't end up using Bitcoin. And I was like, sure, that does nothing. That says nothing about whether your aspiration was valid. And if you stop pushing yourself, if you allow yourself to stagnate, if we allow our culture to kind of stagnate, then it will stagnate, right? Like you have like ultimately, like maximalism should be about doing what's best for Bitcoin in other instances and falling short. Like it has to be a default unattainable goal. And again, the sort of like Twitter class, again, like we've created this culture of heroes, right? And again, like we have to, even the people who are at that status, they need to be pushing forward. Like, can they do more? Like, you can always do more. It's hard. This should be hard. We're trying to do something that isn't possible. We're trying to meme this currency into the global reserve currency of the world. We're going to face every degree of opposition, And I think we need a value structure that helps us get there. So, if you check out the article, I mean, I tried to put everything in there that I could think of. It seems like the conversation has been positive. Some people have, really said that I should have got, because it's kind of divided into like 9 commitments that that Bitcoin maximalists have, and I guess I should have added a 10th. The religious faction really is upset at me because I didn't add a 10th. I actually didn't really even see the thing when I was doing it. But yeah, look, I mean, we have to have a positive conversation about our values. And I think like these kind of things like shitcoin, like cults, like, everything is bad as fiat. I was saying this the other day where it's, we're really critical of the other cryptocurrencies because they use all these fucking technical buzzwords. But we use social buzzwords like all the time. Like, shitcoin is a social buzzword. It means nothing in the same way that decentralization used by the Ethereum people like means absolutely nothing. Like they're just using a random buzzword. And I think we also need to fight against these in Bitcoin. Like, let's get rid of these like cultural buzzwords and try to focus on like, what do you mean? Like, what do you mean by that when you say that? What are you trying to say? And I think if we can get better at that, we can get better at, again, like speaking positively. Otherwise, we allow people to define ourselves. And I think that's what the other kind of anti-maximalists have been so effective at doing, is that allowed they've allowed the whole of the kind of crypto world and the financial world to kind of see Bitcoin in a negative light. Because we've kind of refused to define ourselves, they in turn have defined us, and they've defined us very negatively, right? And I don't think that's true. So, that's why I'm here.
Yeah, right. So yeah, I think it is important as well. I mean, it does come into that conversation about not accepting, let's say, the frame that somebody else gives you, but choosing your own. And I think that's an important thing, rather than just kind of letting other people define who you are, define what your goals are. Well, no, like, we all set our own goals and our own
Mm-hmm.
desires and aims. So
Yeah.
I think we'll probably finish up there. So listeners, make sure you check Pete's article. I'll put it in the show notes. It's over at Forbes. Of course, check out bitcoinmagazine.com. Follow Pete on Twitter at Pete_Rizzo_.
Wow.
And I think that's it, right?
Memorized my Twitter handle. I love it. Yeah, man.
Yeah,
Enjoy
man.
the conference. I appreciate chatting. And look, it's great. It's great debate. I mean, hopefully we can continue it. I love the work that you've been doing on BitcoinMagazine.com. Particularly the stuff around kind of credit lending and where that goes in Bitcoin. So I hope you kind of push our culture forward too. I mean, I'm not an expert in Austrian economics. Never have been, but we need people from all different walks. So appreciate it, man.
Fantastic. Well, thanks, Pete. Chat soon.